South Korea is a free country, and simply leaving is pretty easy. Leaving on favorable terms with all that is rightfully yours is much more difficult. The goal is to have a clean exit or a smooth transfer. A clean exit is when you get all the money legally owed to you and get to leave immediately after the last day of the contract. It is common for new deductions or sudden complaints to appear in the last month or week of the contract. In the majority of cases, they are simply excuses not to pay you. However, it is reasonable for the employer to deduct some money to pay utilities for the last month, as you won't be there to pay the bill. Even if the deduction ends up being a bit more than you usually used, this is often easier than letting the employer wait for your utilities bill to come before paying you. That bill could become a great excuse to pay you very late or not at all. If you really do not like a certain job, you may want to transfer to another job immediately and not wait for the end of the current contract. This is not ideal, as you have to give your employer a reason why you don't want to work for them anymore, and then ask them to give you a signed letter that gives you permission to work for someone else. Of course, you do not need this letter if you want to transfer to a job in another country. Also, you do not need a letter of release to get a new job in Korea after you finish the contract. Why is it so difficult to get a clean exit? At first glance, it seems that the employer would want to follow the law to avoid litigation and follow the contract to avoid embarrassment. In reality, there are a few factors that make not paying a tempting option. At the end of a contract, the employer has to pay the normal salary, severance pay, and sometimes a flight ticket. This adds up to at least 2 months' salary that needs to be paid in a short time to someone who they may never see again. Ignoring the moral aspect for a moment, a potentially large amount of money can be saved here with little effort. Saving money is attractive for any business. There could also be a mental discounting at risks going on. The employer's reputation among teachers is a long-term concern, as the business only needs to recruit teachers every year or so. The focus of most employers is quite short-term, so whatever they owe you becomes just another cost to minimize. Filing a complaint with the Ministry of Employment and Labour is fairly easy, but foreigners don't know how to do it, and these claims take a few weeks to resolve. The employer might assume that most foreigners won't hang around that long after finishing their contract. There are ways of getting your money, even if you are outside Korea, and we will talk about them later, but again, the employer may assume most foreigners will just give up. When it comes to transferring to another job, the employer may be worried that you would work for a competitor in their area. This is a somewhat valid reason to withhold a letter of release, and most contracts have a clause that prohibits working in the same area for some time after the end of the contract. It is generally safer to avoid working close to your previous job. Now that we have looked at motives and preferences, let's look at some tactics you can expect from employers. Stalling in some form is quite common, as they assume you will give up and leave before getting paid, or accept some smaller amount just to wrap things up sooner. Asking for more time to pay due to cash flow issues is somewhat valid, as the business gets a fairly steady stream of income throughout the month, but needs to pay salaries all at once. However, the business should be able to pay you out of its reserves or get a short-term loan very easily. Interest rates in Korea are quite low. The boss would also often use personal problems as an excuse to delay payment. Although sickness and family issues can disrupt the life of any employer, these misfortunes are suspiciously common around the end of contracts. Another possible but less common excuse is that the employer is waiting for some documents before they can pay you. They might ask to see your booking confirmation for your flight before paying for flight allowance. At the risk of sounding paranoid, this is rather suspicious if you are still waiting for other money. A booking confirmation shows when you are planning to leave, so it could encourage the employer to keep stalling until then in hope they might not need to pay at all. We suggest that you keep your final departure date vague and emphasize that you can change the date of your flight. If your employer insists on seeing a booking confirmation, make preparations to access your money from outside Korea. Using salami tactics means slowly taking or doing something in small pieces in the hope that the other party won't respond to relatively small provocations. Employers apply a variation of this when they make some deductions that they believe won't provoke you into taking action. In this situation, emphasize the importance of following the law and the contract. Imply that you may contact the authorities just to make sure everything was done right. Put the focus on following the law and downplay the fact that you want your money. It is easy to criticize greed, but there is hardly anything to be said against wanting to obey the law. Another tactic is claiming that you caused some kind of loss to the business. This is more commonly used against inexperienced teachers. The more job experience you have, the easier it becomes to refute this claim. Claiming compensation for losses is actually a valid legal principle in Korea, but it is usually applied where someone suffered a loss as a direct consequence of negligence or incompetence. For example, restaurants can be sued for compensation if their customers get sick and have to miss work. In the context of teaching, it is hard to prove that the poor quality of someone's work caused losses for the business. Either way, in this situation, it is best to ask for documented evidence of poor quality work over time or written warnings. In the overwhelming majority of cases, there would be none. Also emphasize that you would have liked to know about any possible issues earlier so that you could have corrected them. Any employer might also start changing your work schedule towards the end of the contract. Be very suspicious if you suddenly get extra vacation time or permission to leave work early while your colleagues work on their usual schedules. This could be a ploy to later claim that you did not actually finish the contract and thus shouldn't get severance pay. In this situation, just keep going to work for your usual amount of hours and let your colleagues see you are there, even if you end up doing very little actual work. Try to generate as much evidence as possible that you were at work for the required hours until the last official day. We have just looked at some common employer tactics and how to respond to them. But let's discuss the vulnerabilities that we are actually exploiting here and some principles to do so optimally. The first one is something that is important for any business: reputation. Openly criticizing any person or business in Korea is risky, as even criticism based on true facts can lead to defamation claims. Therefore, when dealing with a difficult employer, be intentionally vague as to your intentions and keep threats veiled or implied. Also express emotion before hinting at possible negative actions. For example, never directly say that you would put the employer on a blacklist. Rather say that you are disappointed and would have wanted to recommend them to other teachers, but won't be able to do that if issues aren't resolved favorably. If the employer fails to follow the contract or Korean labor law, you can obviously take legal action. Lawyers generally don't have any interest in these cases, but reporting violations to the Ministry of Employment and Labor generally gets them resolved. You can lodge a petition to the ministry through the government's petition portal. They generally work to resolve issues quickly, as foreigners have limited time to stay in Korea on their work visas. but the whole process might end up taking a few weeks. Your employer has 14 days after the end of your contract to pay your final wages and whatever else they owe you. Only after that can you file a valid petition, which would take some more time to process. The petition can be filed from outside Korea, so if you have a way to access your money, your travel plans do not have to depend on when you get paid. Take care to fill in the relevant information on the petition form. State the facts simply and clearly with evidence. It is a good idea to type or write everything on a separate page and edit it before submitting. There are a few ways of getting your money from your Korean bank account to your bank account back home. Sending the money while you are in Korea is generally the least effort in terms of setup. A bank transfer is the simplest way, but the fees can be quite high. Go to your bank with someone who can translate or a note saying that you want to transfer money. Also take the details of the bank account you want to transfer to. A remittance account is a special account for sending money internationally. Any money that you transfer to this account would be sent to your account back home. Not all banks offer this, so ask around. The procedure is similar to opening a normal bank account, but you need the details of the target account back home and the bank's SWIFT code. There are other money transfer services too, like Western Union and TransferWise, but we won't explain them in detail here. Getting money from your Korean account when you're not in Korea requires a bit more preparation. Online banking could require slightly more effort than one would expect. The bank sometimes needs to install antivirus or other software on your computer. When using an app, make sure that it would work while not connected to Korea's phone network. It is best to transfer money to your Korean remittance account. If you try to use online banking to transfer directly to your account back home, the bank's system might block it. In summary, let's look at some guidelines when dealing with your employer towards the end of the contract. Whenever talking to the boss or colleagues about your plans, create the impression that you want to stay in Korea for a while to explore or visit friends after your contract ends. This implies that you will have time to deal with any money issues. Although you can deal with these issues from outside Korea, the belief that you are staying to see things through shows resolve and is somewhat more intimidating. If another foreign teacher is taking over your job, make it clear to everyone that you would be in contact with this teacher after you leave. The employer would be more likely to treat you fairly if the new teacher is going to hear about it. As the end of the contract approaches, be especially careful to keep clear records of time worked, material taught to specific students, and messages between you and the boss or any management staff. Take photos whenever possible. If there are face-to-face conversations about pay or your last workday, try to record them or send a follow-up text to confirm what was said. A final remark. In a situation with relatively large amounts of money and uncertainty, it is easy to get too emotionally involved. This is counterproductive and unnecessarily stressful. We suggest formulating a strategy with optimal responses for likely scenarios and following it while accepting the risk that a clean exit might not always be possible.